You may have heard the name Bella Dodd. Who was Bella Dodd, and how did she infiltrate the Catholic Church as a communist, starting in the 20s when she went to Columbia University and later taught at Hunter College? A lot of half-truths floating around about Bella Dodd. We're going to get to the facts and to the original sources with author Dr. Mary Nicholas right here on the Patrick Coffin Show. Don't go away. This episode brought to you by Coffin Nation. Check out coffinnation.com. It's the largest restoring of culture community in the world in 25 countries. We do live webinars. We have summits. We have a closed Facebook group, deep dives. It's all about recovering the DNA damage done to the West, especially to America, in light of the gospel of Jesus Christ without compromise. coffinnation.com. Check it out. Joining us from her beautiful home in Maine, Dr. Mary Nicholas, author of an unpublished manuscript on the infiltration wrought by Bella Dodd, is Dr. Mary Nicholas. Hello, Mary. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
How did you first hear the name Bella Dodd? Did you have a kind of a Kennedy moment when her story kind of crossed your desk and captured your interest?
Well, I think I was always interested in communism and specifically the infiltration of the church. Um, my mom was very learned and had friends who were actually trained by good CIA agents. And she used to come home with these stories. And one day, my aunt had just come from a meeting of she used to go to the communist meetings with these big hats, very dramatic.
Yeah.
And she came home and she knew my mom had just joined the Catholic Church. And she said, Barbara, do you know that these people have infiltrated every single church and don't think they won't infiltrate yours? And that sort of stuck with me for a long time. Then, with various things that were going on in the church, I wanted to get a grasp of what the truth of the church was at that point. It was so mixed up in the 60s and 70s. So I went back to school to the good John Paul II Institute and got a beautiful training in theology and especially on marriage and the
Can you just tilt down a little bit? Your computer went up a little bit. Just tilt down again. Yeah, much better. So you wanted to know what's the intellectual history of this weaponized ambiguity? How did the Second Vatican Council come to be the source of so much division, misunderstanding? As Archbishop Vigano said in one of his recent letters, no one in history ever argued about the spirit of Trent or the spirit of Vatican I, right? And so that led you on a journey to find out who the intellectual architects of all this were. Am I interpreting you correctly?
That is correct. And actually, we read various documents on Vatican II at the John Paul II Institute, but I never took to them. It didn't mean anything. They were dry. It was like, look, there's been a revolution. What is going on? And they gave you these dry excerpts from Vatican II. But they did give there were wonderful lectures and wonderful people there at the time. And it just sort of set me off on another search. And I kept going and going, like, what has happened to our church?
And what kinds of names did you come up with in addition to Bella Dodd, as far as infiltrators go?
Well, I somehow met Dr. Alice von Hildebrand. Do you know her?
Okay. I've met her once. I'm a huge fan. So she was the wife of Dr. Dietrich von Hildebrand and a personal friend of Bella Dodd.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I don't know at what point exactly that I met her, but as soon as I did, she's got a great deal of knowledge about the church and philosophy. And we just sort of like bonded. And she was the living link between Bella Dodd and what went on in the church. She had been furiously trying to get information out, and I don't want to say it was hijacked, but it certainly didn't come out. And her husband Dietrich was very good friends also with Bella, and they used to speak together at different platforms back when everything had not yet come out. So I wanted to get to the facts of how Alice knew her and what had Bella told her. One of the first things I found out, which is perhaps unfortunate, we don't know, was that Bishop Sheen, who was her spiritual father and converted her, had forbidden her to mention the names of the people in the church who were guilty of treason.
Yeah.
And
I definitely want to get into Bishop Sheen. Bishop Sheen is such an important hinge in the Bella Dodd story. But maybe we can press rewind a little bit and go back to the 1920s. Bella Dodd was born, spent early childhood in Italy in a kind of a rural, idyllic setting. She notes in her book, School of Darkness, a lot of idyllic, kind of dreamlike memories of a strong Catholic background, even though her parents were not exactly devout. There was a sort of sacramental memory attached to her childhood in Italy that she comes to New York and in high school, she was almost run over by a tram car, correct? She had a part of her foot amputated.
Correct.
And ended up at Columbia University. So it's the flappers, it's the 1920s, it's the Gatsby era. You have people like Dorothy Day, fellow travelers, right? It's a time of foment, I should say. The Russian Revolution was getting off the ground, and Russia had begun to spread her errors, to use the phrase of Our Lady of Fatima. And this was her ethos, right?
This was exactly, and actually it was more astounding than that, because when she was in high school at Evander Childs High School, which has been mentioned in the House hearings on communism and education, she had a student give her the paper called The Call, which was it was a newspaper devoted to socialism. And she became enamored with that. You can read the stories. And so when she was in high school, she would see a headline on the newspaper that said, "Socialism wins. The Russians have the right answer." It's just astounding. And as a, sort of, what's the word? Impressionable young child, she bought all that hook, line, and sinker.
Think of the twisting of language there. Here's a woman with a Catholic backdrop meeting propaganda by the best wordsmiths in the world. Communist propaganda is, you have to give it a kind of evil genius credit, because when we think of the phrase "the call," it sounds like the Christian call, the call of God. So they're tapping into a natural religious aspiration and tilting it toward communistic ideals.
And that's absolutely correct. And in fact, she said for the first time in her life, she felt a call to go out and organize and do all these things. So it did strike her exactly like that. Yeah. She said she remembers just being enamored with these headlines and things that were going on. It was written very well, and it made a very deep impression on her in high school.
Did she know Dorothy Day? Is that known, if those two crossed paths?
I never heard it mentioned. But one other thing about her book, which is devastating, is I have met several gentlemen who used to sort of protect Bella when she went through all her hearings and threats and everything else. And they would just hang around her apartment and meet with her and discuss things. And one day this man he said to me, you know, Mary, that manuscript was 3 times thicker. So what happened was after she became sick, they took her to the hospital, and in between that time, somebody went in and ransacked her apartment and obviously got rid of the original manuscript.
What was in the manuscript?
The manuscript was a lengthy discussion of everything she had been involved with, names, organizations, whatever, and that was all wiped out, unless it was the publisher.
I see. So that could have been her equivalent of Whittaker Chambers' book Witness, if it hadn't been
Absolutely.
absconded, right?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. What would you give to read that now, right?
Oh, it would be incredible. Incredible.
And so she gets a PhD, correct? She was also an attorney.
She was an attorney. She didn't get a PhD. She went back and got a degree in political science, and then she sort of made a U-turn and went into law. And
I
her
see.
reason for doing that, she said, is not to practice law, but to change the law.
I see. Well, that makes sense. I think it was comedian Jerry Seinfeld who said that lawyers are basically they're the people who know the rules on the bottom of the board game box, and therefore how to tamper with it, how to twist it, and where the line is between legal and illegal.
Correct.
I saw her referred to in one of the documents as Dr. Bella or Dr. Dodd, but perhaps that was, she got a JD or something.
Sometimes they will use that for the abbreviation that goes after an attorney. Most people don't use that, but she did.
I gotcha. Okay. And she, like most communists at the time, was very idealistic. She wasn't doing this to be devilish. She had a natural care for the underprivileged, which ironically ended up getting her in big trouble when she tried to help out this landlady. The landlady story is very telling about her character, I think, and her outing, and then her being demonized by the party. Tell us about that. It's a very interesting anecdote.
She made friends with this European woman who lived near her, and she was the owner of an apartment. And that sounds like somebody would be pretty comfortable, New York City, upper income. But it wasn't so at that time. They were really caretakers and barely made ends meet. And many of them used to duck the rent law, which obliged them to pay a certain amount, on their apartment. And so all of a sudden, somebody caught up with this woman, and she was going to get a tremendous fine and whatever for not paying her tax. And Bella had befriended her and said, "I'll help you out." Innocently, she still didn't know where the party stood on these things. That was not the party line. So she was able to get to court and represent this woman and make a deal with the judge that the woman would pay back the money she owned, but just leave her, to be the landlady and give her time to pay it back. So the landlady promised to do that, and she did do that, but the party found out about it. And one of the things in the party is that you walk all over landladies. You don't give them a break. They're the capitalist class. So
don't help the bourgeoisie.
Yep, they got after her for that. And I suppose that was one of the first awakenings for her as to, in fact, that was in the Russian constitution that, basically we would get rid of the landlord class.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that was a hard lesson.
People forget that the phrase "the party line" it's a reference to the Communist Party. You don't want to
Correct.
step out of the party line. Also,
Yeah.
you mentioned I'm always interested in the history of phrases. Nowadays, we talk about political correctness, but that has its origins in communism, and wanting to avoid incorrect thought,
Correct.
ideas, loyalties that will get you in trouble. That's where it comes from. So PC culture was kind of came from this communist soup, right?
Correct. And we're living in it right now in the United
Yeah.
States.
There's a lot of attention now thrown on this great reset and the fourth industrial revolution, and you'll have no property, you'll have no privacy, but you'll be totally happy. That's just communism rebaptized. Am I wrong?
You're absolutely right. And the other thing is it's playing itself out. You could do a separate study in the COVID
Yes.
infection. If anybody says anything, no matter how scientifically correct they are, but it's against the official PC,
Yeah.
they're taken right off Skype and everything else.
Yeah. It's definitely the oligarchs in bed with media elites. It's a marriage of all the bigs: big science, big media, big pharma, where doctors are behaving like politicians and politicians like doctors. Very disorienting. And of course, the oligarchs don't want to let this crisis go to waste. I always say you don't have to know who the players are behind the scenes. You just have to see the power plays, which are concrete and kind of obvious at this point. I don't believe Whittaker Chambers mentions her. I haven't seen a reference so far in Witness. I have to think that they would have had overlapping duties, or at least shared committee members, or clandestine alliances. Are you aware of any connection?
It's a good thought. I have never seen her refer to him, and I've never seen him refer to her. He was really in the deep underground. She was out. She was the advertisement on Park Avenue. She was, theatrical. He was much more hidden, and I think the time lapse when he first came out is slightly before her.
Yeah. What makes me think they may have met is that they both went before congressional committees. Both really, literally risked their lives to put themselves under oath and basically snitch on the giant system that they lived under and thought they were serving well. It, I guess they have similar stories, and the communist leadership turned on both of them.
Correct. I think that's a good thought, but I'm not sure the dates exactly of her testimony and his testimony. I think his came first.
Yeah, I think that's right. She's mainly in the 1950s, right?
Correct.
And that's a wealth of information, isn't it? The questions asked and the answers that she gives.
It's a miracle that the testimony has even survived. And I
Mm-hmm.
would be very, leery about somebody throwing that down the drain because they're priceless in terms of what they exposed.
Did you apply under Freedom of Information Act to get this?
No, no, these were all available, but
I see.
at the rate things are going, who knows?
Right, right. She gets married to John Dodd that she met overseas, and it doesn't sound like a quickie marriage, but it wasn't very happy. He, I
No,
believe, abandoned her, and she never remarried, right, and kept his name, but never
she
didn't
didn't.
marry again.
No, she didn't remarry. It was very sad. She was so busy with party work,
Yeah.
speaking, organizing. It drove him crazy. And um, so one day he said, "I'm not sure there's anything left of you. Who am I following with this?" Because he was actually patriotic.
Yeah, he was
And so,
Air Force, right? He was military.
yes,
Yeah.
so he left, but there was a mystery as to whether they had a child. I'm convinced that there was a child, and I've looked all over in records, cannot find it. And these men who knew Bella very well said that he went to one of the military academies, which would
Oh.
make sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I cannot find the documents. I've been to the New York Public Library all over. So
That's
I'm assuming there was one child,
yeah.
boy, but I can't do anything with it. And it was very sad because she never saw him again.
Yeah. That's an interesting window onto the way the culture back then, let's say the 30s through 50s, dealt with adoptions and clandestine children. I'm thinking now of Thomas Merton, who did a stint at Columbia, and I wonder if he would have had any interaction with Bella Dodd and his hanging out with fellow travelers, as he did with now servant of God Catherine Doherty. Catherine de Hewitt Doherty, the founders of Madonna House, was one of the reasons why Thomas Merton became a Catholic. There's a whole chapter on her called The Baroness in the Seven-Story Mountain. So that was all that 1920s
Yes.
post, kind of the American equivalent of the Weimar Republic, right? Flappers and
Yes. Yes. And actually, part of this, I think the year Bella started high school was 1917. So the revolution was transported to this country the same year.
And you say, and this is a revelation to me, communism had a beachhead in America before the Russian Revolution.
Correct. Correct.
Tell us about that.
1828, 1845, there were Marxist revolutionary parties here in the United States. They never were, they never were quite vocal or very well known, but they slowly prodded ahead. So they were influencing different people. I have 1828, I think, as one of them, and the 1857 as the Working Man's Revolutionary Party, which did go on to become much more influential and larger. But we think of things starting in the 1917, and it's had started the socialist revolution in America started way before that.
So this is communism before Marx in a way. You're talking 1828.
Correct.
So Marx didn't invent it. He just kind of instantiated it as a pamphleteer, right?
I think that would be a good way of saying it. Yes.
One of the things we're going to kind of track now to Bella's departure, expulsion, and verbal abuse and so on the part of the Communist Party in America. But one of the things that you bring out that I think bears mentioning is that popes were well ahead of the curve. The document Quanta Cura is 1864, and before that even Pius IX nailed what's wrong with communism in very specific terms before Marx finished any of his books. I find that an interesting chapter. You think the Catholic Church has this, obviously helped by the Holy Spirit, but there's an intuition that communism is a salient and maybe credible false religion with a global scope. That's why it needed to be disassembled bolt by using logic and argumentation to see its inner contradictions.
I think that's an excellent way of putting it. Where do we start? The early encyclicals and statements on communism are probably more appropriate today than they were then.
Mm-hmm.
And they were always counted on by the church and historians, theologians, until recently. And the big change with that came with Vatican II, unfortunately.
Yeah, I've talked about this with Paul Kengor, who notes this in one of his chapters on the devil and Karl Marx, that the faction, if you will, the movement in the church that supported people like Cardinal Mincendi, who was in prison, who was tortured, and faithful Catholics living behind the Iron Curtain, were practically begging the leaders of the church to unambiguously condemn this evil system, this satanic world strangulation, basically human strangulation on a mass scale. And schemas were presented in the early 60s, condemning communism.
Yes,
They never saw the light of day.
Be presented at Vatican II,
And
there was the big fight. The Rhine flows into the Tiber, where the author documents what went on to hijack those documents, and they were never openly presented.
This is Ralph Winkin's book, right? Winchin? Right. I'll put that in the show notes at patrickcoffin.media. Yeah, unlike other schemas that were edited and massaged and kind of given a once-over, the schemas related to communism as being condemned were totally deleted. You will not find any reference to communism in the documents of the Second Vatican Council, except for a footnote. With references to previous papal teachings.
Right.
So do you think it's a way of...
That whole story is
Well, in a way, it covers the communist sympathizers who had red hats at the time could always say, of course we dealt with it. Here, look at Gaudium et Spes in this little footnote. So as if to diffuse the criticism, when in fact the whole schemas were dropped, deleted, not touched whatsoever. Mary, what is Ostpolitik? Because Ostpolitik as a geopolitical strategy supported by Paul VI through his Secretary of State, Cardinal Casaroli. How did that work out for Christians living under communism, this Ostpolitik approach?
Oh, I think it harmed them tremendously. We'll never know. We'll never know. I'm sure they felt betrayed, just as with China now, you could call that Ostpolitik. With China now, they feel betrayed. No, up until this time, the church stood up for these people who were being persecuted, who are dying for their faith. And all of a sudden, you're on your own.
Yeah, maybe we could call the China would be far Ostpolitik.
Far, yes.
When Mary, when Bella Dodd fell afoul through her kindness to the landlady representing her, that was not a singular event, correct? There were other threads of thought that she was following down, that things begin to crumble for Bella Dodd. That correct. Sounds like the kind of the last straw thing that gave her the courage to realize I can't keep doing this. And I noted I was wincing my way through your manuscript when she's called up to the 11th floor, the dreaded, meeting. She's called onto the carpet, and these humorless, grim-faced, shark-eyed people, basically telling her that the end is nigh. You're done.
Yeah. I think we probably can't appreciate fully her position at that time. She loved the party. She had lived for the party, and she was devoted to it. So for this to happen was really crushing for her. And I think it took her a while to open her eyes and see what was going on. She still was idealistic about it. And how do you wipe out, 30 years of propaganda? It's very difficult. But so we have to admire her, not only for that, but other things where she really faced up to the truth. Other people in the same position would not have made a fuss or would not have said anything more. It would have been done. They'd close the door and go home. And she was determined up until the end, to really find out the truth and what was going on.
Am I remembering correctly? It was Christmas time, and she found herself alone and wandered into a church in New York.
Yes.
And that was kind of a singular grace that brought back all of that sacramental tinged childhood memories. I'm kind of compressing a lot in that, by putting it that way, because
that is correct.
Yeah.
She was really down and out, and had very few friends left at that time. Most of the uh, teachers, students, all the people she knew in the party had repudiated her, wanted nothing to do with her. So she was living in New York City, you can imagine, in an apartment near the New York Public Library. And she'd hear the bell ringers at Christmas and whatever, and she was devastated. And for some reason, she did have two friends who were going to spend Christmas Eve with her, I believe. Um, Wonderful friends who never abandoned her and who were going to sit and they were going to read scripture on Christmas Eve. And somehow she was near enough to St. Francis of Assisi Church in New York, and she went in, and I think it just, you know, popped all the illusion right out of her.
She got smoked by the Holy Spirit and maybe some incense.
Yes.
And how did she come to meet Bishop Sheen, who I believe may have been Monsignor Sheen at this point, famous for his Catholic radio hours? He memorized the Soviet Constitution, an expert on Russian history, loved the Russian people. In fact, Bishop Sheen's chalice was given to him by a Russian, so he had a great love of Russian history and literature, music and art and that kind of thing, but a proper hatred of communism. Was his expertise in communism the reason why Bella Dodd was drawn to him, or was there another personal connection there?
No, not at all. At this time, she said she was being followed by two people, the FBI and the KGB. So her life was really precarious at this point. And she went down to Washington to represent somebody, I believe, in a lawsuit concerning, visas and getting into this country. And during her trip, she came across an old friend who lived near her in Westchester, who was by now a congressman and a very good Catholic. And he knew her story. He knew what was going on. And he stopped her and he said, "Bella, do you want me to get you some help?" And she said, "No, I have all the help I need. I have the KGB after me or the FBI. Leave me alone." And which is pretty gutsy because, I mean, you can imagine they were following her. So finally he said, "Well, if I can't help you, would you speak to a priest?" And she said, "Yes, I would like that." And she'd, of course, been away from the church all this time. So he said, "I know a young Monsignor who teaches at Catholic U by the name of Fulton Sheen. Would you like to see him?" And she said, "Yes, I would." So he called, and somehow he was going to see her that night. So she took a taxi over. And of course, in the taxi, she was having second thoughts. But she got there and she said, "I'll always remember him opening that door," because she thought he'd give her a scolding or something. And he just was as charming as ever and said, "Dr. Dodd, I am so glad that you have come." And he must have known her story. So they went in to his little chapel. There was a statue of Mary, and she said she just sobbed. Just sobbed.
But didn't rush back. There was you have to cooperate with grace, right? It's not like she knelt down, said the sinner's prayer, he heard a confession. She was still kind of evading the hound of heaven at that point, correct?
I would say that's correct. And she was still very unsure of the future and where she was going and whatever. So he said to her, "If you're ever in New York, please look me up." Well, doesn't he get transferred to New York? And she still sort of evaded this issue. And finally, through another friend, she met him. And his point, Bella Dodd was brilliant. She was a really brilliant person. And he said, "Well, Bella, if you're really going to do any good in the church, you have to learn and educate yourself about the church," because her education was up to the first grade peasants abdication, they didn't really know, which I think applied to a lot of immigrants at that time. So finally, when he went to New York and did meet him, um, he sat down and he taught her the catechism.
Yeah, because she was doubly handicapped. Not only did she have low catechetical formation, but all her intellectual and social formation was at the hands of the enemies of the church.
Correct. Yeah.
And was this about the same time or within the same decade as another high-profile communist revert/convert, Louis Boudin's, the editor of the Daily Worker? I have to think Boudin's must have known Mary Dodd because of his newspaper work.
I'm sure, and yet things I've read, I haven't seen any exact reference, but it's the same time period, and it's also Bishop Sheen.
Yeah.
So they were certainly at the same time, and the story with Boudin's is that Bishop Sheen, Venerable Sheen, called him up and said, "I'd like to have dinner with you."
Yeah.
And that's how they got started talking and whatever.
As I recall, Bishop Sheen's my spiritual father. He's one of the main reasons why I came back to the church. There's an anecdote he tells about Boudin's and his wife having a disputation late at night. And he blurts out, "I think I'm going to become a Catholic." And she goes, "Well, so am I." And it was because
really?
they both read something that Bishop Sheen had said or heard something. I'm rereading. I'm writing a book on isms, and I'm rereading now Communism and the Conscience of the West, which
is an excellent book.
It reads like he put it together last Tuesday.
Yes. He knew everything. He knew it down to its guts, as it were. And I think he must have felt somewhat defeated, I would think, in terms of what happened to the church and other things.
Yes. Yeah, he was kind of put out to pasture. I know that there's a famous clash with Cardinal Spellman, which would take us far afield of the Bella Dodd topic. But I wanted to get to the central fact of Bella Dodd that a lot of Catholics have sort of half heard about, but they don't know the facts, and that is her claim to have trained and deployed over 1,000 communists into American seminaries. Where is that in her life? She doesn't mention it in School of Darkness. What's the source of that assertion?
That's a good point. Fortunately or unfortunately, Bishop Sheen had forbidden her to mention the cardinals she was in touch with when she was active in the party. So those names will never be known. When Alice Hildebrand was speaking, she was quite friendly with Bella, and they were speaking one night. I think Dietrich was still alive, and it was after Vatican II, and Dietrich said to Bella, I just think that the church has been infiltrated. And she said, "You think? I know." And then she told the story. And he said, "Well, tell me the names. Tell me the names. I have friends in Rome." And she said, "I cannot. Bishop Sheen would not let me do that." So that is like a hanging chad, as it were.
Yeah.
But in terms of and also in terms, so she was dealing at that time with 4 cardinals at the Vatican. And what you have to know about communism is that it never stays stationary. It spreads. It's like an evil poison. They get cells, they get their friends, they add to it, whatever. So those were 4 cardinals, which would turn into 40 or whatever. And then she said, I put 1,100 men into the seminaries. And again, no names were mentioned. But using the same analogy, 1,000 people in the seminaries would turn into 4,000. They form cells. They influence people.
Yeah,
they are the true missionaries.
They're convert makers.
They are.
So we can kind of maybe it's reasonable to multiply that by 4, which puts us almost to 5,000.
That's
And
enough to do incredible damage
was it?
because it would influence the professors.
Yes. There's a guy called John Gravino who's done really good work on this. He in examining the sexual abuse crisis of starting in 2002 and then again with the Summer of Shame with Uncle Ted McCarrick, he drills further down into which textbooks were used, who ran what seminaries, because it all begins between the ears, doesn't it? It's all about
Absolutely.
ideas versus ideologies. And communism is such a effective false substitute for the fullness of the truth. All it lacks really is that they don't have an anti-pope, but they have everything else. They have a hierarchy, they have dogma, they have heresy, they have punishments, they have inquisitions, they're like a fake upside down Catholic Church. It is a little bit maddening to not know their names. I agree. But it's one of those mysteries of providence. Bishop Sheen had lots of opportunity to expose his boss, Cardinal Spellman. He never did, even though people with eyes to see could kind of see what was going on. Did she keep in touch with the people that she deployed? Is much known about her follow-up and tracking their progress and giving attaboys and getting updates?
No, I've seen nothing about that. I'm sure she knew, but that was a solid secret. And I think after she converted back to the church, she had terrible sorrow over what she had done. She realized it, deep in her heart. And there may have been other people putting communists in seminaries. If you were Satan, you wouldn't just use one person, right?
That totally makes sense. So, and this would have been. Sorry, go ahead.
So we cannot begin to appreciate what happened to the Catholic seminaries. It had to have been diabolical. And in fact, speaking about diabolical, there was an interesting quote. They had it on, there's a YouTube that's still up called The Days of Bella Dodd. And the people who spoke, one was a Goldsboro who knew her. I think he interviewed her before she testified in Congress. And Bella, not only being brilliant, she was a fantastic, effective speaker. I have her tapes and I have permission to publish them. If you listen to any of them, they are absolutely dynamite. And in one of them, she said, because she spent the rest of her life speaking against communism and trying to mend fences and whatever, people used to listen. They'd be on the edge of their chair. And one night, somebody said to her, Bella, if you knew who the head of the Communist Party was, who would you say it was? And this man said, people were falling off their chairs. They expected to say, whatever, this one or that one. And she said, it is Lucifer.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Did she discover upper management super communists that were above Foster, above Browder, above that cabal, but less than Lucifer? Kind of overlords of communism? You make some reference to that in the book, and it got my attention.
Good question, but I think that the answer is partly in the manuscript, which is missing. Okay, why would they go in and abscond with all her notes and whatever? Okay, they knew, she knew. And as far as I can understand from these people I met and what she's written, she knew right up to the top.
Mm-hmm. How can I help you get those tapes disseminated? I'd love to hear her voice.
Oh, I'll email them to you.
Sure,
Um,
that'd be
those
fascinating.
tapes are priceless.
Yeah.
They were she used to give um, talks to different groups like the um, School for Freedom and whatever, with some very wonderful people like oh, who's the man? Skousen. I don't know if you ever
Yeah.
heard his name.
Yeah, Skousen. He's the guy from Utah who was at FBI. He wrote
Correct.
The Naked Communist.
That's one of the most important books.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been in touch with his son, but Skousen would speak with her as well as Dietrich van Hildebrand and other people. And so I got in touch with the people who have, I guess you'd say, been given the tapes that she gave, and they're mind-boggling. They're so effective. It's as if she was speaking today.
Because she crisscrossed the country again and again and again. There's almost like
Correct.
no crowd, 10 people or 10,000 she wouldn't get in front of.
Yep.
Do you believe that was sort of her commitment to do lifelong penance for what she knew was a long game of infiltration that she herself helped to lead? Is that
I
a
believe
caricature?
so.
Is that it?
I think that's it, and I wouldn't be surprised if Bishop Sheen told her to, because he's a great one for um, what do you call it? When you restore something that you've destroyed.
Sure. Yeah, he definitely had that sense of you have to have restoration. You can only do it through reparation. I believe the
Yes.
analogy he liked to use was if sin is an arrow and it wounds you, yes, a doctor can remove the arrow, but guess what? You still have a hole, and that hole takes time.
Perfect.
That's the way I remember him. Most of my good thoughts come from Bishop Sheen. So, as my friend Scott Hahn once said, "The good borrow, the great steal." So there it is. She died in 1969. She had gallbladder surgery, and her health was kind of in decline. But it sounds like after she was expelled from the party and came back to the Catholic Church and became a disciple of Jesus Christ, that she had an appreciation of the brevity of life too. She just from the behavior of her zeal for speaking, it sounds like life is short, and I'm just not going to write a book about it and retire. I have to be on my feet constantly, going. Even though some of that time was in a wheelchair. She already had a foot injury, right? She was run over by a tram car.
Her foot was amputated in the trolley accident, but she had a number of medical problems. And the men that I met, that I spoke to, are convinced to this day that she was assassinated. And I don't think there's evidence of that. You can't, of course, get medical records from hospitals anymore. How convenient. But I think there's enough in her health history to conclude that it was probably natural causes. She had gallbladder problems. She had problem with her legs. She had a heart attack, I believe, the year before. Her vessels were not good. So I think it's not unusual to conclude that they were natural causes. So it also shows you that she was not very healthy when she was running around the country. I believe in the later years she took a nurse with her, but she was committed.
Cleon Skousen, that's the name.
Yes.
It's a kind of an unusual name. It's like a Dickens character.
Yes.
I'll put that in the show notes, by the way. It's a very important book, The Naked Communist.
He's a wonderful person.
Yeah. And you've corresponded with his son.
Yes.
Well, I would love to. I want to throw as much of this out to people. It's a message that needs to be heard. And thank you for getting this manuscript together. I'll do what I can to make it an actual book. So I feel like I'm somewhat teasing my audience by talking about all this, but I do want this interview to go viral as well, because Bella Dodd's story of training and deploying educated, effective communists into Catholic seminaries at a young age would explain a lot of things, like the decision to completely delete any form of condemnation of communism at the Second Vatican Council. It makes a lot of pieces of the puzzle click together. And and I thank you for putting it all in one place, Dr. Nicholas. Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your time very much.
Thank you. I think the main thing with the book is that unless people have been doing research and know what's going on, they won't believe it. They won't believe it. That's the state that we're in now. Denial.
Yeah, and what we're up against is so ginormous that people, they need a lot of sugar to make the red pill go down.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
All right. Well, thanks again. Godspeed, and I hope to keep in touch.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right. All right. This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?
Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.